"We don't have Sommerstide at Mommy's house," Katie Miller said as she climbed out of her car booster seat. Sam Miller helped his 6-year-old daughter down out of the car with a smile. "Nope, you sure don't," he replied. "In fact, you want to know something really cool? Hollows Grove is the only place that has Sommerstide." "Really? That is pretty cool." "Yep, I told you it was." He took her hand before they started walking over the wet grass. There were only a few other cars parked nearby. He had made sure that they got to the hazelnut tree grove early in the day to beat the rush that would inevitably be coming later. The mud was a bit deep, and to make things easier, Sam scooped Katie up and carried her the rest of the distance to the trees. They stood in a dozen neat rows, their branches stretching out over the walking paths to form a green canopy. The girl looked up at the leaves with wide eyes. There weren't groves like this in New York City. "Daddy?" she asked as she reached up to touch some of the lower hanging leaves. "Yes, honey." "What is Sommerstide, anyway?" They reached the center of the grove. A number of baskets were neatly stacked near one of the trees. The ground was firmer here, so Sam set Katie down and handed her one of the baskets. She took it with a confused look on her face. "Sommerstide started a long time ago," he said, taking her free hand and leading her off the main path and between the trees. "In fact, it was started by the people that first lived here. According to legend, when they arrived, they were confronted by the spirits that lived in the deepest, darkest parts of Oregon. These were evil spirits, and every night they would come out from the trees to torment the settlers." "Why didn't they just leave?" Katie asked curiously. "That's a very good question. They couldn't leave. These settlers were poor, and they'd used everything they owned just to make it here in search of a better life. Since they couldn't just pack up and go back east, they had to find a way to live with the spirits." "Did they?" "Yep, they sure did. A very smart man named Jed Blake went out into the woods one evening just before it got dark. When the sun set, the spirits woke up and found him standing there. They were so surprised by his bravery that they allowed him to speak. He explained to the spirits that he and his fellow settlers didn't wish to disturb them, and that they feared and respected the spirits' powers. He proposed that, in exchange for being allowed to stay, the people of Hollows Grove created an offering to the spirits once a year." "Did the ghosts say that was okay?" Katie asked. Sam shrugged. "They must have, because the town is still here, and Sommerstide is when we make our offering to them." She looked around nervously. "There are real for true ghosts here?" He smiled reassuringly and put a hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, honey. It's just a story. The settlers back then were very superstitious. Do you know what that means?" Katie shook her head. "It means... well, it sort of means that they were believing in things that we know now aren't real. There's nothing for you to be scared of. These days, Sommerstide is like a second Halloween." She instantly perked up. "Do I get to wear a costume and go trick-or-treating?" "Yep, you sure do. Except people don't pass out candy, and you don't say trick-or-treat. You say feed the flames instead." "Oh." She looked deflated. "There's no candy?" Sam reached up and pulled a green round object off of one of the nearby trees. "When you go to a house and say feed the flames, the person gives you one of these. This is a hazelnut. At the end of the night, all the children take their collected hazelnuts to the town square. They're all gathered there together and put into a big bonfire. That's the offering to the spirits." "Why would they want hazelnuts?" He chuckled. "They probably wouldn't. It's symbolic, honey. It's meant to show them that they're being remembered and honored. Like I said, though, it's all a big party. You don't get candy at the houses, but when you turn in your hazelnuts, there's all kinds of candy and ice cream and cotton candy and all kinds of other things. Plus, there's going to be a magician and some other really fun things to do. You're going to love it." "I can't wait," she said with a happy squeal. "That's my girl. Now, let's pick some nuts to put outside our house, okay? Just grab the ones you can reach and put them into the basket. And there are no bad ghosts here, right? They reached another of the open paths between the rows of trees. From here, Sam could see the dense forest off in the distance. It was a bright morning, but the sunlight didn't quite touch the tall pines. They remained covered in shadows. The warm wind caused their tops to sway back and forth. The thick trunks remained still, however. Despite the summer heat, he felt a small shiver run down his spine. "That's right, honey," he said quietly, his eyes still locked on the forest. "Nothing bad here." Adam Black was just in the process of finishing the sketch he was working on when he heard the front door of the house open. Sighing, he closed the sketchbook and put away the pencil before reaching over and picking up his phone. If his father was home, that meant that it was almost time for him to leave for work. The time on the phone confirmed it. It was only 20 minutes until his shift started. Luckily, it was just a short walk. He stood up from his desk and went over to his closet. Retrieving his work shirt, he put it on and shoved his sketchbook into his backpack before tossing it over his shoulder. He went over to his door and listened for a few moments. Everything seemed quiet on the other side. With a small nod to himself, he went out into the hall and headed towards the front door. His hand was on the knob when he heard the raspy voice behind him. "Where the hell are you going?" his father half asked, half demanded. Adam froze. He recognized not just the tone in that voice, but the inflections and cadence as well. He felt an involuntary shudder run through him. Harry Black was drunk. Again. He knew better than to just open the door and leave. It would make things easier right then and there, but they would be a whole lot worse later on. He slowly turned to face his father. The man was dressed in jeans and a t-shirt that were both stained with oil. His father made a living fixing cars and performing odd jobs for the residents of Hollows Grove. It wasn't much of a living, and a good portion of Adam's own paychecks had to go towards the mortgage and utilities. To hear his father tell it, though, he was the most important man in town. "Well?" his father demanded. "Where the hell are you going, boy?" "I'm going to work, sir," Adam replied, making sure to keep his own tone respectful. "Work?" His father shook his head and took a drink from the can of beer he was holding. "You really think that selling a bunch of comic books and toy crap to kids is going to work?" Adam kept his mouth shut. He knew from experience that there wasn't a good answer to give when his father got like this. It didn't matter that the total earnings he had made in the last year was more than his father's, even though a lot of that time had been spent in his senior year of high school. Because he was working in a retail store and not in some job that his father considered respectable, it didn't matter in the man's eyes. "What's in that backpack?" his father questioned. "Give it here." Adam hesitated for a couple of seconds before doing as he was told. His father set the beer down on a nearby table and unzipped the backpack. He extracted Adam's sketchbook and flipped through the first pages. He shook his head in disgust. "This is what you've been doing in your spare time?" his father asked. "Drawing stupid pictures? Like some damn kindergartner? You need to grow the hell up, boy." Adam barely managed to catch the now empty backpack as his father threw it back at him. It wasn't a gentle toss, and the zipper struck him painfully on the cheek. "I raised you better than this," his father continued, grabbing his beer. "I taught you to use your hands and tools so that you could be useful. You turned out to be just another waste of goddamn space. That's your mother and you." Adam somehow managed to hold his tongue. He wanted to snap back at his father, yell that the reason his mother had left him was because he had been such a piss-poor husband, that his drinking and laziness had driven her past her breaking point and out of their lives. He didn't say anything, though. "Get the hell out of my house," his father told him, turning to go back into the kitchen. Go waste your time at that kiddie store. I'm done looking at you. Adam quickly turned and hurried out the front door. Despite the harsh words, he knew that he was getting off easy. If he had encountered his father after a few more drinks, there was no way that he would have made it out of the house without a few new bruises. He was running late now, and he hurried down the sidewalk towards town. It was still early enough that the day's heat hadn't yet arrived, and he shivered as the cool, wet air chilled his skin. He probably should have grabbed his jacket, but he had been so preoccupied with leaving that he had forgotten to. As he walked, he turned his attention to the houses lining the street. A number of people were in the process of decorating their homes for the Sommerstide celebration that night. In a way, it was similar to decorating for Halloween, but it was much more based in nature. Instead of cheap plastic decorations, the residents were putting up wreaths made of hazelnut tree branches and hanging strings filled with a variety of leaves. One of his neighbors was in the process of constructing a small fire pit in front of his house. While the bonfire on the town square would be the main focus of the celebration, many people would burn smaller fires of their own as part of the decorations. Adam had always loved those particular houses when he had been young enough to participate in the gathering. Even in the summer, the nights in this part of Oregon could be cool, and the kids would gather around the fires to warm up and compare the number of offerings they had collected. He stopped as he passed one particular house. This one was in much rougher shape than the ones around it, the paint peeling off of the structures and the lawn yellowing in many places. It was owned by Stanley Crockett. Most of the town considered him to be a crazy old man, but he had been nice to Adam during their few interactions throughout the years. Hanging on Crockett's front door was a human skull. It wasn't actually one, of course, but it had been made to look like the real deal. It hung from a thin wire that had been screwed into each temple. A candle had been placed inside of it, causing a pale yellow light to shine through the eyes and nose holes. Adam stared at it curiously. He couldn't recall Crockett's house having ever been decorated for Sommerstide, but this year, the old man had hung up a Carver lantern. With a shrug, he began walking down the sidewalk again. It had been a long time since Adam had last heard the story of the Carver. As legend went, a mysterious man stalked Hollows Grove every Sommerstide, cutting off the heads of those that he crossed paths with. He would then remove the skin from the heads and turn them into grotesque lanterns. Every kid in Hollows Grove knew the story. It was one that parents used to try to keep children from wandering off into the darkness during the celebration, especially into the woods. The story said that the Carver's workshop was somewhere in the forest. Adam was roused out of his thoughts as he reached town square. Normally it was fairly quiet in the mornings, but today it was filled with workers preparing for the coming night's festivities. Most of the businesses had the branch wreaths on their doors, and more than a few had small Sommerstide displays up in their windows. In the very middle of the square, a group of people with construction equipment were constructing the bonfire. Large logs harvested from the nearby woods had been stacked high in a pile, and they were being adjusted into place with chains. Nearby, the town mayor and the head of the fire department were deep in conversation, their attention on a stack of papers the mayor was holding. Neither of them seemed to be enjoying that particular conversation. Adam reached his place of employment and fumbled around in his pocket for a set of keys. Hollows Grove was a small town, and the majority of the time the store only required one person working to handle the customers. This was one of Adam's mornings to open. He unlocked the door and went inside. As he headed towards the back room, he passed rows of displays containing toys, comics, and various collectibles. The locked vault was the only place in town that specifically catered towards geek culture. It was also one of the few places where he felt almost completely at ease. Hanging his backpack near the back door, he crossed over to the breaker box and flipped the switches. The overhead lights sprang to life. He closed the metal panel and went back out into the store to start his shift. For a long time, Jennifer Hines stared at herself in the mirror, the brush held up to her hair, but her hand not moving. A few minutes earlier, she had sat down at her changing table to start getting ready for the day, but the sight of herself had caused her to pause. It was the large dark bags under her eyes that had caught her attention. For the last week, she hadn't gotten much sleep. Normally, she slept through the night without any issues, but recently, she had been suffering from a series of bad dreams. Although she couldn't remember the details, they'd been bad enough that she had woken up covered in sweat and unable to go back to sleep each time. She wondered why the dreams were happening now when they had never been a problem before. Maybe it had something to do with her recently having been accepted to college. It was a good thing, sure, but it also came with some downsides. Forcing herself to snap out of her thoughts, she shook her head and went back to brushing out her hair. She didn't have time to be tired. There was too much that she needed to get done. Jennifer finished getting ready and went downstairs. Before she reached the bottom of the stairs, she paused with her hand on the railing as she heard voices talking in the kitchen. She frowned. One of the voices was her mother's, and the other was an uninvited guest. Not completely unexpected, but uninvited all the same. She took a moment to mentally prepare herself before continuing on into the kitchen. Seated at the table were her mother and a young man her age. Travis Cooper smiled at her as she came into the room. "Morning," he said pleasantly. "Ready to go? We don't want to be late." She bristled slightly, and she knew by the slip in his expression that she didn't hide it well. Part of her didn't care. The other part of her, though, the part that came from her upbringing, scolded herself for feeling annoyed by his presence. He was probably just trying to be helpful. "Yeah, sure," she answered. "Just let me grab something to drink." She opened the refrigerator door and pretended to look through it. In reality, the water bottle was right in front of her and didn't require any searching, but she was using the door to block his view of her while she composed herself. Her family owned a local restaurant, and they had purchased booth space at that night's Sommerstide festival to sell food and drinks. Caramel apples, popcorn balls, pie, ice cream, that sort of thing. It was something that they did every year, and it was always popular. They didn't make much, if any, profit from it, but that really wasn't what it was about for her parents. They looked at it more as serving the community of Hollows Grove than it being a part of their business. Jennifer's sister Carrie had agreed to get the booth set up so that her parents could concentrate on getting the food prepared, and Jennifer had offered to help. She had used that assistance as an excuse when Travis had wanted to get together. It hadn't been an offer for him to tag along, but apparently he had taken it as one. Realizing that there was no point in delaying the inevitable, she grabbed the water and closed the refrigerator door. She said goodbye to her mother and she and Travis left the house. It was humid and warm outside, and she almost instantly felt sweat begin to form on the back of her neck. She crossed her arms over her chest as they walked. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm fine," she lied, producing a small smile. "Just surprised at how warm it is." "Do you want to go back and change or something?" "Nah, I'm good." If Travis was noticing the awkwardness, he wasn't showing it. For some reason that annoyed her even more. She tried to tell herself that it wasn't a big deal that he had invited himself along. It wasn't a very convincing argument. They had been dating for years, but something had changed recently in their relationship. No, she mentally corrected herself, not in the relationship. She had changed. Ever since they had graduated, she had been reevaluating things as she tried to figure out who she was and where she was going now that she wasn't just a high school student. Taking stock like that had brought her to a few uncomfortable realizations about the person she was, as opposed to the person she had thought that she was. She glanced over at Travis. It wasn't just herself that she had turned the magnifying glass on. All through high school, she had thought that he was an attractive and confident guy that had a few rough edges, but was sweet and kind on the inside. That had actually been true when it came to how he treated her. It wasn't until she had put aside the rose-colored glasses that she had been completely honest with herself about how he was with other people, though. He could be kind of an ass to other people. Something to her right caught her attention. She turned her head towards the movement. They were walking past a large section of trees, which wasn't surprising given that Hollows Grove was surrounded by forests. This particular stretch was particularly dense, and the light of the day didn't penetrate very deeply into it. Shadows moved and twisted as the trees swayed slowly in the small amount of wind flowing through them. She didn't see anything out of the ordinary. There was something about the shadows that made her feel uneasy, however. Not the shadows. Something in the shadows? Maybe she had seen an animal moving around in the underbrush. Whatever she had glimpsed out the corner of her eye hadn't looked like an animal. It had been for just a split second, so she couldn't be sure, but she had thought it had been... She couldn't find the right word for it. Less substantial. Like the image of someone formed out of the effect of heat rising from hot concrete. "What are you looking at?" Travis asked, his voice an odd mixture of concern and annoyance. Taking one last look at the woods, she turned her attention back to him. She must have just imagined whatever it was she thought she saw, or if she didn't, it wasn't there now. Probably just a trick of the light. "Nothing," she replied, giving him another forced smile. It was nothing. Katie was fascinated by the construction of the bonfire. Sam sat on a bench with her as she silently watched the workers maneuvering the heavy logs into place. It was something that he saw every year, so he didn't really think about it anymore. But now that he was really observing the process, he had to admit that it was impressive. "So that's where I'm going to get my treasures?" she asked. "Your treasures?" Sam asked, turning his attention to her. "Yes, my treasures. My candy and toys and things." "Ah, of course, your treasures. Yep, that's where you'll get them. There will be someone waiting there to count the hazelnuts you get during the gathering. The more nuts you have, the more things you can get." She nodded in understanding. "I'm going to get a lot of them then. I'm going to get the record. What's the most hazelnuts someone's gotten?" He grinned. "I don't think anyone actually keeps track of that kind of thing, honey." She shrugged. "Well, whatever it is, I'm going to beat it." Sam shook his head in amusement. She got her competitive streak from her mother. Right now it was wanting to get the most prizes. It probably wouldn't be long before it branched out to things like sports and academics. Hopefully that was where it stopped. He heard a familiar voice behind him. Hoping to avoid being noticed, he slid a bit further down on the bench. The person was speaking to someone else, and with any luck they would pass by without turning their attention towards him. That was possible, even likely. There was a lot going on in the downtown area after all, and they were surely going to be too busy to notice him sitting there. "Ah, good morning, Sam," the voice said suddenly. He felt the small amount of hope that he had been nurturing drain out of him. Making sure to keep his expression pleasant, he turned so that he could face the speaker. Parker Hoyt was the youngest mayor ever elected in Hollows Grove. Although he had only been a couple of years behind Sam in school, his youthful face made him seem younger than that. He was wearing a polo shirt and a pair of white shorts. The combination would have been more at home at a country club or on a private golf course. "Mayor Hoyt," Sam greeted him. "How are you today?" "Busy," Hoyt answered with an ease and likely practiced smile. "There's still a lot to get done before the festivities tonight. Not as much as there will be next year, of course, but still enough to keep me busy." Sam internally winced. Ever since his election the previous fall, Hoyt had been talking about his plan to expand Sommerstide. Halloween was big business, he asserted, and Hollows Grove having what was essentially an exclusive day like that could be marketed to bring in loads of tourists. There was even the added benefit of Sommerstide taking place during the summer when kids were out of school and families were already taking vacations. There hadn't been enough time to implement his plans last year, but he was already taking steps to institute his plans the following year. From a purely financial standpoint, what Hoyt was proposing made sense. It would bring more money into the local economy, and if done right, the sky was the limit in terms of growth. Sam could understand where Hoyt was coming from. The problem was that this was Hollows Grove. The issues with Hoyt's plan had nothing to do with business. The time was quickly approaching when Sam would have to introduce the mayor to some realities that he doubted the man was ready to know. To be fair, most people weren't when they were, as his old boss had put it, smartened up to things. He himself certainly hadn't been. He'd have to keep that in mind when the time came. He made a mental note to set up an appointment with Hoyt in the next few weeks. For today, though, it was best just to get through the festival and assorted activities. "Is this your daughter?" Hoyt was asking. "She is," Sam confirmed. "Katie, this is Mayor Hoyt." "Hello," Katie said pleasantly. "Well, hello yourself," Hoyt replied before turning his attention back to the sheriff. "Is everything ready to go for tonight on your end?" Sam nodded. "My deputies will be patrolling the festival area beginning an hour before the bonfire is lit. They'll be able to handle things. There's rarely anything worse than a few drunken disorderlies. I won't be on the clock officially, but I'll be available in the event of an emergency." "Good. I'm still not thrilled that you won't be with them all night, though. That seems like the sort of thing the head of the department should be doing." Sam bristled slightly. This was a point that they had been coming back to repeatedly over the past month. "I put in my notice of time off last year," he said, unable to keep all the annoyance out of his voice. "It was approved then as well." "After I was elected, but before I took office," Hoyt pointed out. "How convenient." "Nothing convenient about it. I put in the notice the same day that I found out my daughter would be staying with me. It's just how the timing worked out." Hoyt seemed unable to find something in his words to argue about. Finally, without so much as a nod, he turned on his heel and walked off towards the person managing the bonfire preparation. Sam watched him for a few seconds before turning his head away in disgust. "I don't like that man," Katie declared, crossing her arms over her chest. "Is that okay to say, Daddy, that I don't like someone?" "Normally I'd say no," Sam admitted. "In this case, though, you go right on ahead disliking him." Adam's workday was fairly uneventful. It was basically a local holiday, so there weren't very many customers. The few people that did come in were all looking for horror comics, not surprising given the day, and he was happy to give them his recommendations. Two of the customers also ended up purchasing some horror-related memorabilia. For the most part, though, nothing much happened. Gavin Walter showed up to relieve him in the afternoon. As the owner of the store, he pretty much set his own hours, but he also did his best to make sure that Adam, his only employee, worked enough hours to make his paycheck worthwhile, but also let him have a life outside the store. He greeted Adam with a smile and jokingly told him to get the hell out of his store. Adam laughed along with him and went back to retrieve his backpack. He had been working for Gavin since he was 15, and he had always liked the man. He seemed to go out of his way to make the locked vault a place that felt like home. Adam sighed. Better than home, really. "Have you decided what you're going to dress up as?" Gavin asked as he came back out into the main room. "I don't know. Probably nothing," Adam replied. "I just graduated high school. I'm a little too old to be putting on a costume for Sommerstide." His boss frowned slightly. "Plenty of adults dress up for Sommerstide. Hell, I do. Want to know why?" "Yeah, sure. Because I and those other folks know a little secret. Now, I'm going to pass that secret on to you. Ready for it? Okay, steady yourself, because this is going to change everything for you." Gavin leaned in, and despite himself, Adam did as well. "Here it is," Gavin said. "The secret is, life's too damn short to worry about something stupid like being too old to have some fun." Gavin grinned. After a moment, Adam felt a smile spread across his own face. He knew when he'd been beaten. "I'll think about it," Adam promised as he opened the store's front door. "You do that," Gavin replied. "Just in case I don't see you tonight, have a great Sommerstide." "You too." It was a lot warmer outside now than it had been when Adam had arrived for his shift. Not only was it hot, it was also humid. It felt like he was wrapped in a wet blanket. Within a minute, he was sweating. The preparations for that evening were almost complete. The logs for the bonfire were now raised up and lashed together to form a pyramid-like shape, and much of it was decorated with fresh tree branches covered in leaves. The work crews had left, so either everything was finished, or whatever remained to be done would be finished closer to the festival start time. He was so distracted by the wooden structure that he nearly collided with two people walking the opposite way down the sidewalk. One of them, a girl, called out just before he did so. He snapped his attention back to what he was doing just in time to stop moving and step out of the way. "Oh, shit, sorry," he mumbled in embarrassment. He recognized both the people as having been members of his graduating high school class earlier that summer. The girl was Jennifer Hines. He had known her since kindergarten, and when they had been younger, they had been close friends. As they had grown older and their interests had diverged, they had spent less and less time together, and eventually they had stopped doing so altogether. They hadn't had a falling out, and they were still friendly towards one another when they bumped into each other, in this case, almost literally. It was just that they didn't have much in the way of common interests. Jennifer had grown into a very attractive young woman interested in sports, while Adam had seemed to get more and more awkward as he got older and cared very little for athletics. Even though it had been quite some time since they had gone their separate ways, if he was honest with himself, he missed being friends with her. He didn't have many of those, so losing one always stung just that little bit more. "What the hell, Black?" her male companion demanded. Adam turned his attention to the boy accompanying her. If he missed being around Jennifer, the exact opposite was true for Travis Cooper. He had seemingly gone out of his way to torment Adam all throughout high school. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to why that was. That tormenting had died down somewhat in their senior year, and Adam had been hopeful that meant that Travis was finally starting to mature, but apparently that wasn't the case. Travis and Jennifer had been dating for nearly 2 years. Adam couldn't fathom why she was with him, although he knew that he was biased about that. "Stop," Jennifer said firmly. "It was an accident." "How's it going, Adam? I haven't seen you since graduation." "Not bad," Adam answered lamely. "How about you?" "Things are going good. Oh, I got accepted into Cornell, so that's pretty exciting. I start there in the fall." "Hey, that's great. Congratulations." Travis's expression was one of annoyance. He moved ever so slightly so that he was partially between Adam and Jennifer. He was taller than Adam, and he scowled down at him. "We need to go," he said shortly. "Oh, right, we do," Jennifer agreed, looking over at the large clock at the top of the town hall. "My sister is in charge of my family's booth at the festival this year, and we told her we'd help with setup. Are you coming tonight?" "I'm not sure yet," Adam said. "You should. It'll be fun. Talk to you later." She and Travis moved on, with Travis giving him a quick over-the-shoulder look. Adam turned around and continued on his way. He sighed. He really didn't want to go home. Maybe he would find some place to hang around for a few hours, wait until nightfall and return for the festival. With any luck, his father would drink himself into a coma by the time he got back to the house. "Adam, wait." He came to a stop and turned back around. Jennifer was jogging towards him, having left Travis further up the sidewalk to stare after her angrily. She caught up with him and brushed a lock of hair out of her eyes. I didn't want to say anything in front of Travis," she said slowly, "but I saw the bruise on your arm." Adam glanced down at his right arm. A spot of purplish-black skin was showing just under the sleeve of his shirt. He mentally swore as he pulled the cloth down far enough to cover it. "Is that from your dad? Is he still—" She left it hanging. They had been friends when Adam's mother had left, and she had been there when his father had started to become violent. She was one of the few people that knew about that. "It's nothing," Adam said quickly. "It doesn't look like nothing," she stated bluntly. "Come on, let me see." Without waiting for an answer, She reached over and pushed up the shirt sleeve. He could see her wince as she saw the full size of the bruise. It was a pretty nasty one. "Jesus, Adam," she whispered. "You've got to go to the sheriff about this." "No, I don't," he retorted, more forcefully than he intended. He took a deep breath. "It's okay, Jennifer. It really is." "It's not. He's been doing this to you for the majority of your life. It has to stop." "It will. I'm saving up to move out. Once I do that, I don't have to see him again." She looked uncertain, but she released his sleeve and let it fall back down over his upper arm. She opened her mouth to say something before closing it just as quickly. With a shake of her head, she nodded. "It's your choice," she said finally with a small smile. "I personally think it's a dumb one, but it's your dumb choice to make. Just be safe, okay? Oh, and call me sometime soon. It would be fun to hang out again like old times before I ship off to college." He watched as she joined back up with Travis, and the two of them walked further into town together. That had been unexpected. Did she actually want to get together for old time's sake? Or had she made the offer because she felt bad for him? There was no way to know for sure. He decided to figure that out later. Now, he needed to find somewhere to waste a few hours. First things first. Going into one of the nearby stores, he bought a new sketchbook and a pack of pencils. He knew better than to expect that his old one would still be in one piece when he got back home. Besides, he had time to spare, and he had been wanting to work on his nature drawings and backgrounds. Putting his art tools into his backpack, he walked in the direction of his house. About halfway there, though, he turned down a dirt path that led past the last of the businesses and into the woods beyond. He had never gone down this particular path before, but he had noticed it in the past and had been curious about where it led. It seemed like the perfect time to satisfy that curiosity. The part of the woods he was walking towards was the densest section in Hollows Grove, so there had to be some places in there to sit down and do his sketching. As he crossed the brush line and into the forest, the light immediately dimmed. The trees were close together, and their branches stretched out to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sun. The path quickly disappeared into the dense underbrush. After a brief hesitation, he continued on through the woods. He could no longer hear the sounds coming from town. In fact, the only sounds were the ones he was making as he walked over the leaves and debris. There were no birds singing or insects chirping. It was unusually quiet. The ground sloped downward. Adam began to reconsider what he was doing. It would be easy to get lost, and the turf was becoming more and more slippery. Deciding not to go any further, he turned to leave. His right foot caught on an exposed root. It twisted awkwardly, and the heel slipped in the wet mud. He fell painfully to the ground and landed on his side. Before he could comprehend what had just happened, he was sliding rapidly down the slope. He had no control over the descent. Pain flared throughout his body as he struck rocks and trees. At one point, the side of his head collided with a thick fallen branch, and the world swam out of focus. He reached the bottom of the hill and came to a stop, long before his head stopped spinning. Jennifer's head snapped up as she woke up. It was that dream again, the damn dream that had been stalking her. Once again, the details of the dream were immediately lost. For a few seconds, she had no idea where she was. She looked around and felt the initial panic leave her as she regained her senses. She had been helping her sister Carrie set up their parents' booth in the town square for the evening Sommerstide festivities. Once they had finished constructing it, Carrie had noticed how tired she looked and suggested that she rest for a few minutes in the family restaurant. It was closed that day anyway, and it was dark and quiet without the lights on or patrons at the tables. To the annoyance of Travis, she had quickly agreed to the plan and taken her leave. He had asked what time he should meet up with her for the festival, but she had pretended not to hear him. He had been hovering over her ever since they had run into Adam Black on the way into town. She had asked him multiple times to give her a bit of space. The polite requests had fallen on deaf ears. It had become clear to her that it was time to put an end to things between them. In the middle of town square hadn't been the time or place, however. While their romantic relationship was at an end, she didn't want that ending to be humiliating for him. She owed him that much. She'd wait for a more private moment to have that conversation with him. She stretched and worked a kink out of her shoulder as she got to her feet. The restaurant booths were comfortable, but they weren't the best things in the world to lie down on for an extended period of time. She would have figured out somewhere else to sleep if she had known that she would be taking a nap, but her original intention had been just to close her eyes for a moment. She checked her phone. Although it felt later, she'd only been asleep for about an hour. She frowned. In that time, Travis had sent her 7 separate texts. Shaking her head, she left them unread for the moment. Her mouth was dry. Going into the restaurant kitchen, she took a glass out from one of the racks and filled it with ice and water. She took a few sips before going to the back door and opening it to get some fresh air. Like all of the buildings on this side of downtown Hollows Grove, the restaurant had a small back parking lot for staff parking and deliveries. Just beyond that was the forest. She and Carrie had played just inside that tree line countless times as children while their parents worked, running in and out of the trees while making up games that barely made any sense. She smiled slightly as the memories came to her. Those had been good times. Jennifer turned her head slightly as she heard something moving through the brush. It wasn't a very loud noise. It was just barely noticeable above those coming from the town itself. She wasn't 100% sure it hadn't been her imagination. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. There was something, though. Setting down the glass of water on a metal cart next to the door, she stepped all the way outside and squinted against the light as she scanned the trees. She couldn't figure out what it was that was making warning bells sound in the back of her head. She raised her arm up and felt the back of her neck. The tiny hairs were standing up. Her pulse had quickened, and she was feeling jittery. For no reason that she could see, she was afraid. Were the shadows just a bit darker than they had been when she had opened the door? It was hard to tell, but she thought that they might be. If they were, it was a subtle change. There was also a very faint sound. It reminded her of children whispering. There was no weight to it, though, like it was being breathed instead of spoken. "Jennifer?" a voice said from behind her. She cried out as she nearly jumped out of her skin. Spinning around, she found Travis standing just inside the doorway. Her fear quickly turned to anger. "Damn it, Travis," she burst out, the anger shifting to embarrassment. "What are you doing here?" he asked, ignoring her obvious distress. She turned back towards the woods. Nothing was out of place. The shadows were just shadows, and there were no whispering noises. Everything was just as it had been. "Nothing," Jennifer told him, turning on her heel and heading back to the kitchen. "Travis, we need to talk." The breath had been knocked out of Adam at some point. He laid on the hard forest floor gasping for air. Every attempt burned. He wasn't sure how long it was until he was able to sit up and breathe normally again. Adam did a quick assessment of himself. His shirt had been torn in multiple places, and it hung in tatters from his shoulders. There were multiple bleeding cuts that he could see. His back felt like it was on fire. When he reached around to touch it gingerly, his fingers came back without much blood on them, so he hoped that it was just scratched. His arms and legs were hurting, but working. All in all, it could have been much worse. At some point during the fall, he had lost his backpack. He craned his neck to look up the steep slope, but he couldn't locate it among the trees and brush. Taking a deep breath, he got to his feet and looked around. He was in a small clearing. There was much less ground cover here, and what had managed to grow was thin and scraggly. It was even more quiet here than it had been on the upper trail. When he moved his feet, his footsteps barely made a sound, almost like they were being muted somehow. He wasn't paying attention to any of this, however. His attention was firmly on the old shack that stood in the middle of the clearing. It had clearly been constructed a long time ago. The boards were weathered and gray, and there were multiple places where pieces had broken or rotted away. The door was hanging at an angle. There were 2 windows on this side of the shack, but the glass was mostly broken, and planks had been nailed in place on the inside to block the view in or out. Adam slowly approached the shack, his curiosity barely winning out over his unease. As he drew closer, though, he stopped himself and shook his head. Going inside would be insane. Even if it was as empty and deserted as it looked from the outside, it would still be dangerous. Given the state of disrepair, it was very possible that something could collapse on him, or he could break through the floor and get injured, or worse. Besides, there was no point. He needed to get back home and clean himself up. The last thing that he needed was to get an infection in one of his many cuts. Adam searched around for an opening in the trees surrounding the clearing. Locating one, he went through it and slowly made his way into the woods. Based on where he had fallen from, he was headed in the general direction of his house. Eventually, he would reach the tree line on the opposite side of the woods, and he'd be able to get better oriented there. The trees moved closer together as he continued on. As they did so, the light became dimmer and dimmer until it reached the point where he was barely able to see where he was going. He was forced to slow his pace even further to a crawl. He stopped completely as he heard a noise to his left. It was the sound of leaves crunching underneath weight. Putting one hand on a nearby tree, he turned his head towards the noise. He listened intently. It was probably just a squirrel or some other animal that lived there. It had seemed louder than that, sure, but maybe that was just because everything else was so quiet. More leaves were disturbed behind him. This time the noise was accompanied by another sound, one that resembled faint whispering, but wasn't quite that. He frowned as he turned around to face in the direction it had come from. He wasn't sure how to describe it better than that. It was like the sound that a faint trail of smoke would make if it was able to make a sound. Wispy and changing and fading. Cold chill washed over him. There was something about that sound that made him afraid. He had no rational explanation for his fear. It came from a deep place inside of him, the part beneath the logic and reasoning where the most primal instincts dwelled. As more of the smoke whispers filled his ears, the fear turned to panic, and he could no longer stand to be amongst the trees surrounded by the formless speakers. Adam ran back towards the clearing. As he did so, the smoke whispers grew louder and louder. Multiple times he was sure that he saw movement out of the corner of his eyes, but he kept his attention on making sure that he didn't fall. He was sure that the invisible presences would pull him back into the darkness if he did. Even as that thought crossed his mind, the smoke whispers turned into mocking laughter that echoed all around him. He plunged back into the clearing, and the noises stopped. Hurrying over to the cabin, he leaned up against it as he panted heavily. He turned his head quickly from side to side, trying in vain to spot his pursuers amongst the trees. He couldn't see them, but the shadows beyond the clearing had grown impenetrable, and he knew that they were still nearby. There had always been stories about these woods. Since he was a child, he had heard the tale of how the first settlers in Hollows Grove had made a pact with the spirits that dwelled there. He had thought those were just scary stories told around fires on Sommerstide. Now, he wasn't so sure. What he had just encountered might have been some trick of the wind in the trees, or his imagination running wild, or maybe a side effect of a concussion suffered during his fall down the hill. He didn't believe those possible explanations, but he clung to them anyway. He felt watched and exposed in the clearing. Without thinking things through, he went around the side of the cabin and tried to open the door. It wasn't locked, but over the years the hinges had rusted. He wrapped both hands around the handle and pulled as hard as he could. With a loud screech, the door swung outward and he hurried inside. It closed much easier than it had opened. It was dark inside, especially with the windows boarded up. He stood still in the doorway as his eyes adjusted. He was inside what appeared to be a workshop. Rusted tools of all shapes and sizes hung from the walls, and a pair of large tables were leaned up against the walls. One of the tables had a large vise on it. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, making it clear that no one had been inside the cabin in many years. There was something being held in place by the vise, but he couldn't quite make it out from where he was standing. He glanced back at the door. There was no way that he was ready to go back outside yet. At the same time, he didn't like the idea of being inside of a place like this without knowing everything that was there with him. He came to a decision and walked over to the vise. It was too dark in that section of the cabin to make out what the object was. A window was directly to his left, and he reached over to try and adjust one of the boards to let more light in. He barely put any pressure on it before a large chunk broke off in his hand. Squinting, he turned away from it and returned his attention to the vise. He involuntarily took a step back. Locked between the teeth of the vise, its bone turned brown from age and a few of its teeth missing, was a human skull. The conversation with Travis hadn't gone well, but at least it was over. Jennifer winced slightly as he slammed the restaurant's front door closed and stormed off down the street. As soon as he was far enough that he wouldn't be able to see through the window, she hurried over and locked the door. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The breakup itself was long overdue, and it was a relief to have it over with. What she hadn't realized was just how much the anticipation of the talk itself had been weighing on her. She felt physically lighter now that the deed was done. She decided to give herself a few minutes before she left. Exhaustion had set in again, and she needed a bit to collect herself. She was about to sit down when she remembered that she had left a glass sitting out next to the back door. Her parents didn't mind if she was at the restaurant when it was closed, but they did insist that she cleaned up after herself. Going into the kitchen, she walked around the long counter and headed towards the door. Just before she reached it, however, she stopped. A small line of sunlight was coming through under the door, which was typical for this time of day. What wasn't typical was the shadow that was obstructing the center of the strip of light. It wasn't some trick of the light or some object in the parking lot blocking it. The shadow was moving, like someone was shifting back and forth while waiting for the door to be opened. Her immediate thought was that Travis had returned. There was no question that he had a temper, so she wouldn't have put it past him to want to return to the argument they had just gone through. That didn't make any sense, though. He would have certainly gone to the front door if that was the case, and he had been too far down the sidewalk when she last seen him to check that, realize it was locked, and get around the building before she could reach the kitchen. Someone else was outside. Someone that clearly didn't want anyone to know that they were there. They would have knocked or called out if they did. Jennifer backed away from the door as far as she could while still being able to see the shadow. Hollows Grove didn't have much in the way of crime, especially the violent type, and besides, the door was heavy and had locked behind her when she had closed it. It was highly unlikely that she was in any danger. The hairs on the back of her neck were up again, though, and she was gripping the counter so hard that her knuckles were turning white. Some part of her knew that she was in danger. She took her phone out of her pocket and went to call the police. Maybe it was nothing and she was making a fool out of herself, but she didn't care. It was better than the alternative. She tapped the screen, but nothing happened. Trying again had the same result, so she pressed the buttons on the side of the phone instead. The screen remained black, Attempting to turn it on with the power button didn't yield any results. The phone was dead. Jennifer was sure that it had shown that it was almost fully charged when she had checked the time a few minutes earlier. Now, though, it seemed completely drained. There would be time to figure it out later. She hurried over to the door that separated the kitchen from the dining area and tried to push it open. It didn't move, and she almost smashed her face into it due to her momentum. She took a step back. It was like she had walked into a brick wall. There was no lock on the door, and there was no reason that it shouldn't have easily swung open. She reached out with her foot and pushed. There was absolutely no give to it. A shadow from someone standing on the other side of the door stretched out from the dim light coming from under it. Jennifer backpedaled away from the door and up against one of the walls. From where she was standing, she could see both the shadow from the dining room and the one from the parking lot. Each of them moved and swayed back and forth for a moment or two. They suddenly became completely still. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched. Everything was silent. As if they were being coordinated together, both shadows pushed into the kitchen. It was like a black wave had crashed down against both doors and was flooding through the thin openings at their bottoms. Dark shadows moved rapidly across the floor until they reached the walls and counters. When they did, they shot upwards and around all obstacles. Not able to help herself, Jennifer screamed as they enveloped everything and plunged the kitchen into total darkness. Loud whispers, the same whispers she had heard coming from the woods earlier, filled her ears. They spoke words that she couldn't understand, words that almost weren't words, but were instead simply meanings being conveyed audibly. They were the sounds of madness, the noises of hunger and need, and 1,000 other emotions. Everything filled her head to the point where she was sure that it would start to burst apart. Clamping her hands to the side of her face, she sank down to her knees and begged for it all to stop. Suddenly, mercifully, the whispers fell silent. Jennifer cautiously lowered her hands and opened her eyes. She was still surrounded by a blackness more total than anything she had ever experienced. She wondered if this was what it was like to be blind. She was filled with the feeling of being watched. More than that, it felt like something unseen was taking stock of her, maybe even judging her. She felt naked and exposed before its gaze. A small light appeared in the middle of the darkness. It rapidly expanded until it filled everything around her. As it faded, she found herself kneeling on a forest floor. An old and rotting cabin was directly in front of her. It looked like it was on the verge of collapsing. As she watched, a person dressed in a black rain slicker came out from around the back of the cabin. The hood was up, completely concealing his face. A skull that glowed like a lantern was hooked onto his belt, and an axe with a long handle was gripped in his right hand. In his left hand was a human head. It swung as he walked. As he turned to go towards the cabin door, the face was turned towards her. It was Travis's head. Everything was back to normal. Without any warning, the shadows had disappeared, and she was back in the restaurant kitchen. The suddenness of the change took a moment for her mind to process. On the floor next to her, her cell phone rang. Adam surprised himself by not immediately recoiling or backing away. Instead, he remained frozen in place with his eyes locked on the skull. It had been modified by someone. Metal plates had been bolted to the sides of the jaw, making it so that it couldn't open. A metal wire loop was screwed into the bone, one screw in each temple. Unconsciously, he moved a bit closer and leaned forward. There was also something attached on the inside, a sort of small shelf with a metal ring on it. It was a candle holder. Adam jerked upright and backed up against the second table. He knew what this was, even if he had a hard time wrapping his head around the fact that it existed at all. It was a skull made into a lantern, much like the one that currently hung from Stanley Crockett's front door. Except that unlike that replica, this one was real. This was the Carver's workshop, just like in the stories. He was already moving to the door when he stopped himself. He couldn't go back outside, not with those unseen things out there. Taking another glance around the cabin, he felt the panic drain out of him. Even if this was the Carver's workshop, or at least someone that took the legend way too seriously and had decided to reenact it, it had obviously been abandoned. He wasn't in any immediate danger being here. It was cool inside of the cabin, much cooler than outside. Adam shivered slightly. The remains of his shirt weren't doing anything to keep him warm. Hanging from a nail on the back of the door was a long black rain slicker. Like everything else, it was coated in dust. He took it down and shook the grime off of it. It was in surprisingly good condition despite the age. Removing the last remnants of his shirt, he put in the rain slicker. The slippery material felt cold against his skin at first, but his body quickly warmed it. It was a little too wide, however, and it made it difficult to move around without catching it on things. There was a black leather belt hung with the tools, so he retrieved it and pulled it tight around his waist to keep the rain slicker from billowing out. He almost cut himself on a hook that had been attached to the side. He couldn't figure out why someone would have put a hook on a belt until the realization came to him that it was there so that the skull lantern could hang from it. He had barely finished when the sound of the smoke whispers became audible. Looking out the hole he had uncovered in the window, he found that it had grown dark outside. No, he corrected himself. It wasn't the time of day. The darkness that filled the tree line had moved closer. Whatever his unknown stalkers were, they had decided to come into the clearing after him. He couldn't stay in the cabin, but he also couldn't go outside. He was trapped. He frantically looked around for some way out of the seemingly hopeless situation that he found himself in. What he needed was a light source. If he could keep the darkness at bay, he might be able to make a break for town. Reaching into his pocket, he produced his cell phone, intending to use its flashlight. His heart sank as he saw that it had been heavily damaged in the fall. He pressed the buttons on the side anyway, but the screen remained lifeless. The lantern. He slowly turned his head towards the skull and the vise. It was the only other source of light in the cabin. As much as the idea of touching such a macabre object disgusted him, there wasn't any choice. The metal ring had been empty when he had examined it. There was a large wooden box filled with various items under the other table. Getting down on his knees, he pulled it out and started rummaging through it. He was rewarded with a short candle and a pack of matches. The candle had once been white, but the time and conditions had turned it a sickly gray. He set the items down on the table and carefully opened the vise. The rust made the work difficult. It was only after pulling so hard on the handle that his fingers burned that he was able to make the clamps move apart. He removed the skull and turned it over. The section between the jaw and spine had been left open. He was able to easily insert the candle through the hole and into the metal ring. It fit tightly inside. The matches were in bad shape. The box was disintegrating in places, and the matchsticks themselves weren't doing much better. He was sure that he wouldn't be able to get one to light. To his surprise, the first one he scratched against the side of the box burst to life. Carefully reaching into the skull, he lit the candle. The glow from the lantern was unsettling. Normally it would have been warm and inviting. Projecting from the skull made it seem cold and lifeless. The bone cast shadows that seemed to writhe against the cabin walls. Adam picked it up by the metal wire handle and hefted it. The weight felt strangely comfortable in his grip. He pocketed the book of matches just in case he needed to relight the candle. Steeling himself, he went back over to the door and put his free hand on it, preparing to push it open. No, not yet. He needed something to defend himself against whatever was out there. The answer was just a few feet away from him, hanging from two pegs on one of the walls. Nodding once, he took down the long wood-cutting axe and held it up to the lantern. There was grime on it like everything else. The blade itself was still sharp, though. Perfect. Not wanting to have to set down the axe to open the door, He attached the wire handle of the lantern to the hook on his belt. The skull swung slowly back and forth when he moved, but it stayed out of the way of his legs and didn't hinder his movements. He wrapped his hand around the door handle once again. The more he delayed, the darker it was going to get outside. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He opened the door and went outside, putting both hands on the axe handle as he stepped down onto the turf. The darkness that had surrounded the cabin visibly recoiled, moving far enough to stay out of the light the lantern cast. He licked his lips before taking a few more steps. The shadows quickly shrank back to keep their distance. He felt a momentary triumph. It was actually working. He chided himself. He could be happy that he had been right later. Now, he needed to concentrate on getting out of the forest. Walking as fast as he dared, he returned to the spot where he had originally tried to leave the clearing. He didn't hesitate to cross the tree line. He knew that he didn't have much, if any, control over what happened. All that he could do was keep the axe ready and the lantern lit. There were no smoke whispers this time, nor was there any movement across the leaf-strewn ground, except for his own. Every time he stepped around a tree, he expected to hear or see something unnatural. Each time, he was met with nothing. He didn't know why the unseen things were no longer harassing him, but whatever the reason, he was grateful for it. After what seemed like hours, he finally emerged on the other side of the woods. It took him a few moments to work out exactly where he was. He had ended up a few blocks past his house. With a sigh of relief, he walked towards home. It was dark outside when Jennifer found the willpower to get ready to go to the festival. After what she had experienced in the kitchen at her parents' restaurant, she didn't want to leave the house at all. Whether it had been a dream or a vision or something else entirely, it had been the most frightening thing she had ever gone through. She had made a commitment to take shifts at the family booth with her sister, however. There wasn't any point in barricading herself in her room anyway. If those shadows wanted to get to her again, it wasn't like her bedroom door would be any more effective against them than the restaurant doors had been. Besides, everyone else was going. She would be alone in the house if she stayed behind. The thought of that was far less appealing than being surrounded by a large crowd of people at a town festival. Her mother was at the front door when Jennifer came downstairs. 3 children dressed in costumes were standing on the other side of the doorway, each one holding out a bag. "Feed the flames," they said happily in unison. "Absolutely," her mother replied enthusiastically as she extended the bowl she was holding. "Go ahead and take a few. We've got plenty." The children took 3 hazelnuts each out of the bowl and dropped them into their bags. With a quick thank you, they ran off towards the next house on the block. Jennifer couldn't help but smile. It hadn't been that long ago that she and her friends had participated in the gathering. She remembered how much fun they had had going from home to home and collecting offerings for the bonfire. The smile slipped slightly. In reality, that had only been 5 or 6 years ago, but it felt like it had been a different lifetime. She shook her head to clear it. She was way too young to be thinking that way. She was 18, not 80. Her father and Carrie were likely already at the festival, and it wouldn't be long before her mother joined them. She felt a stab of guilt. She was supposed to have gone with Carrie, but she had begged off when it was time to leave. Most of the town showed up every year at the festival, and they could have likely used her help. She'd make sure they both got a break when she got there. "Off to the festival?" her mother asked, closing the front door. "Yeah, I'd figured that I'd relieve Dad and Carrie for a while," Jennifer answered, sitting down on the bottom step to put on her shoes. "They've got it handled. You just go and enjoy yourself." Jennifer blinked. "What? Why? That's not fair to you guys." Her mother smiled. "That's sweet, but we all talked about this earlier today. You've been pretty distant since graduation. There's a lot of things on your plate right now, and you deserve some time to decompress before you go to college in August. Let us handle the booth. You just worry about relaxing and having fun." She didn't know what to say. Standing up, she hurried over to her mother and hugged her tightly. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Are you okay?" her mother asked as they let go of each other. "Yeah," Jennifer replied, swiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "No, I don't know. But this is really nice of you guys. I think I really need this." "Hey, you know that I'm here for you if you need anything, right?" She nodded. "Yeah, I know. Thanks, Mom." With another quick hug, Jennifer went out into the night. The neighborhood was swarming with children running around as they participated in the gathering. As it was every year, it was a sort of controlled chaos. The parents directed traffic while the children tried to ignore them and focus solely on collecting as many hazelnuts as possible. After all, every nut collected meant a treat or prize at the festival. Hazelnuts were more valuable than gold to every kid in town on this particular night. Normally, she would have simply walked into town. Because of the events earlier in the day, however, she wanted to be able to get back and forth from her house as quickly as possible. Going into the garage, she retrieved her bike. It had been a while since she had ridden it. One of the tires had gone a little flat, so she took a moment to fill it with a pump before getting on the bike and heading towards her destination. She almost immediately started to feel better. The night air blew against her skin as she rode, and she breathed it in deeply. There was a fresh, moist scent in the air, the kind of smell that only occurred before or after rain. Petrichor, it was called. She laughed. Her science teachers would have been glad to know that she had retained something from her years in their classes. As she left the neighborhood, she made it a point to keep her eyes focused firmly in front of her, instead of on the dark, shadow-filled woods lining both sides of the road. It was quite a bit later than it had been when Adam had first gone into the forest. The sun was almost set, and the streetlights had come on. Children dressed in costumes and their parents were already out going from house to house for the gathering. It didn't make sense. He hadn't been trapped at the cabin for that long, had he? It didn't feel like it. He wondered if he had blacked out without realizing it when he had fallen down the slope. A group of excited children ran past him as they moved from one house to another. They barely glanced at him even though he was carrying both the skull lantern and a large axe. An exhausted-looking mother did notice him, however, and she looked him up and down. "Nice costume," she said with an improving smile before hurrying to catch back up with the children. Adam looked down at himself. If this had been any other time of year, people would be calling the police if they saw how he was dressed and what he was carrying. On Sommerstide, though, he fit right in. He arrived at his house and went inside. With everything that had happened to him that day, most of which he was still trying to process, he had forgotten that his father had started drinking early in the morning. The man was sitting in his chair watching television when Adam came inside, and he turned his bleary eyes towards his son. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "And what the hell are you wearing?" Adam didn't know how to explain what he had been through, and even if he could have, he certainly didn't have any desire to explain it to this particular person. "I've been at work," he answered instead, "and this is my costume for the Sommerstide festival." "Goddamn Sommerstide," his father spat out. "What a load of shit. Just an excuse for people to act like idiots." A snarky reply came immediately to mind. Instead, Adam forced it down and remained silent. He started towards his bedroom. There was a loud bang as his father practically threw himself out of his chair. "Don't you ignore me, whelp. You get the hell back here until I say you can go." Adam stopped walking, but he didn't turn back around. A new sound had caught his attention, something quiet but nearby. It was the smoke whispers that he had heard in the woods. They were close, even closer than they had been at the cabin. "Did you hear what I said, you damn idiot?" his father demanded, stomping into the entryway. "Quiet," Adam hissed. trying to concentrate on the noises coming from all around him. "What in the hell did you just say to me?" "I said to shut the fuck up. Can't you hear them, coming from the shadows?" The smoke whispers had grown to a dull roar. It was different this time. Back in the forest they had seemed threatening. They had scared him to the point that he had been forced to hide in the cabin. Now, though, their tones had changed. They were sympathetic, even encouraging. He felt a hand grip his arm tightly. His father's fingers wrapped around the bruise that was still there from the last time he had done that. The man tried to turn him around, but he stood fast without moving an inch. His father tried again with the same result. This seemed to surprise him as he released Adam's arm. "What the hell?" his father said again, this time in disbelief. The smoke whispers increased in volume. Adam could understand them now, not in the same way that he could when he spoke to a person. It was more like he knew the meaning behind their sounds, rather than the exact words. They hadn't been trying to scare him in the forest. They had been trying to help him. That help was the reason why he was now too strong for his father to ever hurt him again. "You're always saying that I need to toughen up and be a man," he said slowly, turning to face his quickly sobering father. "Whatever the hell that means." "Well, here that is, standing right in front of you." His father stammered as he backed away. "You've always been such a prick to me. You blame me for Mom leaving? What a load of crap. Mom left because you're a drunk asshole that thinks being a husband means keeping your wife in line with your bare hands." The smoke whispers pushed for him to keep going. "You're constantly telling me that I'm worthless and that I'm screwing up my life. The only reason you still have a roof over your head is because of me. Not you. Me. You see the common denominator here, Dad? Do you?" Adam pushed the top of the axe head against his father's chest to force him back further. "It's you. You try to blame everyone else for being so damn worthless, such an insignificant fleck of crusted shit, but it's not them. It's you. You're the reason that you drink all day and sit by the phone hoping that someone, anyone, calls to hire you. You pray in your slurred words for God to make you someone worthwhile because you're just too much of a chicken shit to do it yourself." His father should have kept his mouth shut. He should have simply accepted the verbal lashing. He was too drunk for that, though, and his ego wouldn't allow that to happen. "Fuck you, whelp," the man growled. Adam took a step back and swung the axe. The blade sliced through shirt and flesh as it cut into his father's chest. The older man's eyes went wide, and he let out a short cry. His voice almost immediately gave out as blood and foam came out of his mouth and ran down his chin. Adam pulled the axe out and swung it again, driving it even deeper this time. With a quiet gurgle, his father fell to his knees before slumping down to the floor and lying still. The smoke whispers cried out in elation before becoming silent once again. Adam pulled the axe free from his father's body. Given how deeply it was embedded in the man's chest, it should have been difficult, but he was able to pull it out with ease. The head was covered in blood. He wiped it off on a part of his father's shirt that wasn't covered in his own gore. Adam hesitated. He somehow knew what needed to come next, but he also knew that if he did what was required, he would be crossing a point of no return. Clenching his jaw, he raised the axe over his head. He was ready. It took a few hits with the tool to separate the head from the body. He had never done it before, and if he was too reckless, an errant swing could ruin it. Eventually, he was able to complete the task. He knelt down to collect his morbid trophy and carried it into the garage, a trail of blood leading back to what remained of his father. There were tools in the garage that he needed. One such tool was a vise much like the one in the abandoned cabin, only this one was newer and in better working order. He clamped the head into the device and stared at it for a few moments while he decided the best way to proceed. Coming to a decision, he opened a few drawers on the tool bench and collected what he needed. Over the next hour, Adam carefully peeled away the skin, muscle, and tissue from the head. It was difficult work, especially because he needed to make sure not to scrape the skull itself, but he felt a sense of satisfaction when he completed the task. Afterward, he used a curved pick to remove first the eyes and then the brain without having to saw through the bone. The end result was a blood-stained, completely exposed skull. He unhooked the lantern from his belt and set it on the table next to the vise so that he could work out what needed to be done next. He found a pair of metal plates that he was able to bolt into the jaw to keep it closed, but the candle holder inside was trickier. After trying a few different methods, he ended up finding success by cutting a small rectangular section off of a board and stapling on a loop made of sheet metal. He carefully drilled the screws into the makeshift shelf from the outside of the skull. Lastly, he used 2 screws and metal wire to create the handle. With the lantern finished, he went into the house and dug through the drawers in the kitchen. He found the package of candles that his father had kept on hand for power outages and a silver lighter. He returned to the garage, installed the candle in the lantern's holder, and lit it. More of the smoke whispers filled the garage as he closely examined his work. When he was satisfied that it was to his liking, he hooked it onto his belt and picked his axe back up. Before leaving the house, he also collected the lantern he had originally taken from the forest cabin. He walked through the front yard to the mailbox and hung that lantern on the wooden post. It wasn't a display. It was a grave marker. With his work at the house done, Adam began walking towards the town square. Music was blaring over speakers scattered throughout the town square when Jennifer arrived. She had thought that with the late start she would miss the bonfire lighting, but it looked like she was just in time. Instead of going into the large gathered crowd, she maneuvered her bike around the edges and made her way past it. Her family's restaurant was just outside the gathering, which made it easy to quickly unlock the front door, stash her bike inside, and lock back up before walking the short distance back. The town mayor, Parker Hoyt, was just climbing the 3 steps leading up to the stage in front of the bonfire when she found a spot to stand. He smiled and waved as the crowd cheered. He was the youngest mayor in the town's history, and he barely looked older than she was. Her parents weren't big fans of his. He had some plans for expanding the Sommerstide festival and marketing it to tourists that they vehemently disagreed with. She watched as he took his place behind a microphone and the music stopped playing. "Good evening, Hollows Grove," Hoyt called out, his voice slightly distorted as it came through the speakers. "And happy Sommerstide to you all." The crowd cheered. "I hope everyone is having a great time so far. There's a lot more to come, but first, we have a little business to take care of." Hoyt turned to his side and held out his hand to point at the tall wooden frame behind him. Nearly 175 years ago, our ancestors persevered through countless hardships to reach this place and create what would later be known as Hollows Grove. Every year since then, we have built and burned a great bonfire in remembrance. Well, that, and to keep away the spooky ghosts. He said the last part in an exaggerated tone. Most of the crowd laughed along with him. A quick glance around told Jennifer that not everyone had found the remark funny, however. "So what do you say, folks?" he continued. "Let's really get this party started." Someone in front of the stage on the ground level held up an unlit torch, the top of which was wrapped tightly with cloth. Hoyt bent down and took it before fumbling around in his pockets for a moment. He eventually produced a silver lighter and opened the lid. "I feel like I'm about to raid a tomb with Indiana Jones," he said, making a number of people chuckle. "Let's hope that Carl didn't rig this thing to explode." "No promises," someone yelled from the crowd, which caused even more laughter. "Fair enough, Carl," Hoyt replied with a grin. "All right, here we go." He lit the lighter and held the flame up to the torch. The cloth instantly caught fire, and within seconds the torch was blazing. Hoyt seemed a bit surprised by just how rapidly it was burning. He turned and quickly tossed it into the assembled bonfire. The flame from the torch quickly spread across the wooden planks and logs. As she watched the fire climb up the at least 2-story structure, Jennifer had to admit that it was impressive. It was always impressive, but this year the bonfire was larger than it had ever been. Even from the back of the crowd, she could feel the heat coming off of it as it cracked and popped. "Welcome to the Sommerstide Festival," Hoyt declared theatrically. The crowd cheered loudly for nearly a minute. When they had finished, Hoyt turned his attention towards his left. The smile on his face broadened. "Ah, it looks like we have our first gatherers," he said. Everyone turned in the direction he was indicating. A group of costumed children were approaching. They were each holding filled bags in their hands. The crowd parted to make way for them. "Don't be shy, kids," Hoyt told them. "Bring those hazelnuts up next to the stage, and someone will swap them out for what you've all been working so hard for, that sweet, sweet candy. We've also got some other surprises for you this year that I know you're going to love." Jennifer smiled as the children passed by in front of her. There would be a lot more coming soon. Once enough of them come in from the gathering, people would begin tossing the hazelnuts they collected into the bonfire. All the while, the biggest party of the year would be going on all throughout the town square and beyond. She turned to find Travis standing next to her, a serious expression on his face. "I need to talk to you," he told her. "Not right now, Travis," she said. His expression turned stony. "Why not?" "Because I just want to be left alone and have fun tonight. I'll give you a call tomorrow, okay?" "Yeah, fine, whatever." He turned on his heel and stomped away. Jennifer watched him for a moment before turning back to the bonfire. She had hoped to avoid him at the festival, but she supposed bumping into him was inevitable, especially if he was specifically looking for her like it seemed he had been. She sighed. Maybe she was being unfair. They had just broken up earlier that same day. While it was something that had to be done, she also didn't want there to be bad blood between them. Coming to a decision, she moved away from the crowd and headed in the direction he had gone to catch up to him. At first she didn't see him. It wasn't until she had left the lights of the festival behind that she saw Travis leaning against one of the buildings further down the street. He had gotten surprisingly far away in such a short amount of time. He was silhouetted in the dim glow coming from inside the store's window. As she approached, she saw his head turn to the side as if he heard something. A moment later, he collapsed to the ground. A second figure came into view from around the side of the building. Even from this distance, Jennifer could see the skull-shaped lantern attached to its belt and the axe held in one of its hands. The Carver was just as it had been in both what she had been shown by the shadows and in the stories, right down to the hood pulled up over its head. She came to a complete stop and ducked behind a nearby bench. The Carver reached down and wrapped its arm around Travis. It easily lifted him and draped him over its shoulder before turning and disappearing around the building once again. Jennifer counted to 3 before standing up and hurrying over to the store. Carefully, she peered around the corner. She could see the sickly orange glow of the lantern heading towards the forest beyond town. It stopped suddenly, and the figure turned to look back in her direction. It was like it knew it was being watched. She ducked back around the corner and pressed her back up against the store. She wasn't sure how long she remained like that, her heart pounding in her chest and her breathing shallow. Eventually, she gathered her courage and looked back around the corner. The Carver was further away now, and she caught sight of it just in time to see the glow of the lantern disappear into the trees. She glanced over at the bonfire burning in the town square. She should hurry over there and try to find help. The problem was that by the time she did that, the Carver would have disappeared deeper into the forest, and it and Travis might never be found. Even if they were, the vision she had been shown made it clear that Travis was living on borrowed time. Gritting her teeth and cursing herself for doing something so stupid, she turned her back to town and hurried towards the tree line. Sam smiled in amusement as Katie stood in line, the white sack looking gigantic in her small hands. She was almost vibrating in anticipation, constantly getting up onto her tiptoes in an effort to see over the children in front of her. This was her first Sommerstide festival, and she was eager to turn in her collection of hazelnuts for her well-earned treats. The smile slipped just a bit. The reason that it was her first festival was because of the divorce. It was over 5 years since Beth left both him and Hollows Grove. He had moved on past that relationship, at least as much as anyone could after a failed marriage, but the long stretches between Katie's visits remained a constant source of sadness. 3 months out of the year simply wasn't enough. He was getting a bit of a bonus this year, though. Beth had recently remarried, and she and her new husband had gone to Paris for their honeymoon. He was happy for her. He really was. They had managed to stay friends, so there was no bitterness or resentment. Besides, it meant that he got to spend more time with Katie, and he was always going to be happy about that. The girl had insisted on putting together her own costume. He wasn't sure what the end result was supposed to be. There was a cape, fuzzy bear slippers, and a large squirt gun involved. It was a mashup that didn't seem to have any rhyme or reason. Considering Katie's quirky personality, though, it strangely made perfect sense. She was just about to reach the front of the line when Sam felt someone touch his arm. He turned slightly to see his newest deputy, Olivia Benson, looking up at him. She was dressed in a Hollows Grove Sheriff's Department t-shirt and jeans, with her badge hanging from a lanyard around her neck. Her duty belt and gun were around her waist. Unlike him, she was on duty. "Sheriff Miller, I need to talk to you," she said. "I'm pretty sure that I've told you to call me Sam about 1,000 times, Liv," he replied with a smile. "Hold on just a second." Katie had reached the front of the line. She excitedly handed her sack to a festival worker. He took it from her and opened it before pouring the hazelnuts onto a long table. He quickly counted them and wrote down the total on a ticket. She happily took it from him and ran up to Sam. "Daddy, I got 62, she declared proudly. 62, he answered in the same tone. "That's fantastic, honey. I've never seen so many. Let's go over to the prize booth to see what you can get. Walk with us, Liv." He took Katie's hand and they made their way through the crowd. He could feel Liv's impatience as they walked. There obviously wasn't any immediate danger, though, and he had purposely scheduled his vacation to have time off with his daughter. She could wait. When they reached the prize booth, he quickly showed Katie how the process worked. She handed her ticket over to the attendant before going to work selecting what she wanted from baskets full of candy, small toys, and various other trinkets. Each basket had a different point value posted on it. It was a lot like going to an arcade and cashing in tickets won from the games there. With the girl's attention completely on making her selections, he turned his own to his deputy. "Okay, go ahead, Liv," Sam instructed her. "Mary called all 3 of us deputies to get a message to you," Liv told him. "She says that your cell phone isn't on or something. It keeps going to voicemail." He frowned and took his phone out of his pocket. It was on, but with everything going on around the festival, he must not have heard it ring or felt it vibrate. There were nearly a dozen missed calls from the sheriff's office dispatcher. "What's the message?" he asked. "I'm not sure that I understand it," Liv admitted. "She wanted me to tell you that one's been spotted outside of Harry Black's house. Any idea what she's talking about?" Sam felt his jaw tighten. "Yeah, I know what she's talking about. Okay, thanks for passing that on. Have a good night." He could see that Liv wanted to ask more questions. After considering things for a moment, she kept her mouth shut and headed back into the crowd. He went back to watching Katie select her prizes. His full attention wasn't with her, though, no matter how much he wanted that to be the case. Katie finished her selections, and the various candy and toys were put into the same sack that she had originally carried the hazelnuts in. She ran over to him and held it out for him to see. He had noticed earlier that day that she had reached the age where she never walked anywhere. She was always running. "I got so much stuff," she proclaimed. "Yeah, you did," he confirmed with a smile. "That's a ton of stuff. Listen, Daddy needs to go over to the sheriff's station for a bit. While we're there, why don't you show Mary just how amazing you did tonight? Yeah, okay. He took her by the hand and they left the festival, walking down the block away from it. Hollows Grove wasn't a large town, and pretty much everything was in walking distance in the downtown area. It only took a few minutes for them to reach the station. They went inside, and Katie immediately hurried over to the older woman sitting at the front desk. "Look at my treasures," Katie practically yelled. "My goodness," Mary said in that grandmotherly way that she always had. "That is quite the haul, little princess." She looked up at Sam. Her treasures. What a darling way to put it. "That's my darling little daughter," he said. "Harry Black's place?" Her expression became more serious. "Yeah, Father Sanderson called it in. He saw the lantern and—" Sam raised his hand to cut her off, motioning with his chin towards Katie. The little girl was carefully laying out each individual item from her sack onto the desk to display it. She was clearly not paying attention to the conversation going on around her, but he didn't want to take the chance of her hearing any details. There was no point in scaring her. "Would you mind watching her?" he asked. "Not at all," Mary replied immediately. "You go do your thing and don't worry about this angel." "You have to go?" Katie asked, turning her head towards him. "I thought you don't have to work right now." He went over to her and got down on one knee so that they were close to the same level. "Honey, I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't have to," he told her. "I won't be gone long. I'll go take care of this one little thing, and then it's back to just you and me. Besides, I'm nowhere near as fun as Mary is." "That is very true," Mary chimed in. "You have no idea how fun I am. We'll have a ball. Plus, I have cookies." That was all that it took to convince Katie. She gave Sam a quick kiss on the cheek before following Mary into the small kitchen at the back of the station. He made a mental note to bump the woman's pay up at her next review. He squared his shoulders and nodded once to himself. There was no point in putting things off. He stood back up and headed towards the narrow hallway where his office was, to collect his car keys. It was dark under the trees, and Adam unhooked his lantern from his belt so that he could hold it in front of him. He shifted the weight of Travis's unconscious body as he did so. It was surprisingly light. Whatever was happening to him had made him stronger. A lot stronger. He heard the smoke whispers all around him as he walked. They had been with him from the moment that he had left his house. They weren't as loud or as close as they had been when he had killed his father, but they still made their presences known. The changes he was going through were because of them. That much was obvious. What wasn't so clear was why they were doing this. Had they chosen him because he had wandered into their part of the woods, or was it for some other reason? In the end, it didn't really matter. It had happened. He was grateful for what these spirits had done for him. They had given him both strength and a purpose for that strength. He wasn't certain what the full scope of that purpose was yet, but he knew that it was of great importance. Adam stopped walking. Strength and purpose. Had those been his thoughts? Or were those the smoke whispers? He could feel them inside of his head. He let them in back at the house, just for a moment when he had first swung the axe. They had stayed inside of him from that moment, lightly drifting at the back of his mind. Now they were telling him that there would be time to think things through later. They were right, of course. Right now, he had work that needed to be done. With a nod, he continued through the woods. He soon reached the old workshop that he had stumbled upon earlier. No, he corrected himself. He hadn't stumbled upon it. He knew now that he had been drawn there. The shadows had seen something in him and brought him there. They had seemed threatening at the time, but he realized now that they had acted that way to force him to take up the tools that he needed. Not forced. The smoke whispers gently amended that thought. They had guided him. Yes, that was better. Guided him. That made more sense. He carried Travis around the back of the cabin and dropped him roughly on the ground. The impact seemed to rouse Travis a bit, and he moaned and rolled onto his side. He didn't fully regain consciousness, though, and soon he was silent and still once again. Adam stared down at him. His father had been his greatest tormentor, but during high school, Travis hadn't been far behind. He had never been able to work out exactly what had made him such a target for Travis. For some reason, the boy just seemed to hate him. Insults, harassments, being slammed into lockers. Travis had pulled out everything from the bully handbook, and he had always done so with a look of pure hatred on his face. That was then. In the here and now, Travis was nothing. Just meat on the chopping block. The smoke whisperers seemed to enjoy that thought. They danced in his head, eagerly waiting for what they knew was coming. Adam wasn't quite ready to give that to them, though. He sank the head of the axe into a nearby tree stump and set the lantern down next to it. Bending over, he picked up Travis by the neck and slammed the boy up against the side of the cabin. He didn't squeeze hard enough to strangle him, but it was a tight enough grip to keep him suspended off the ground. Once again, Adam was surprised by his own strength. He waited for a few moments, but Travis didn't wake. Using the back of his free hand, he slapped him hard across the face. Travis grunted and moved before his eyes half opened. "What?" he mumbled, his voice slurred. Adam didn't say anything. The smoke whispers were enjoying watching Travis slowly realizing what was happening. Adam had to admit that he was as well. Seeing the terror creep up onto the boy's face gave him a grotesque pleasure. "Black?" Travis asked in incomprehension. Adam squeezed. Travis began to choke as his airway closed. He thrashed his body in an effort to break free, but Adam's grip was like iron. It wasn't until Travis's eyes started to roll back in his head that Adam relented. The boy coughed harshly before sucking in air. The thought of tormenting him further was appealing, but the smoke whispers had already grown tired of the game. Adam casually tossed Travis back towards the tree stump. To his credit, the boy quickly scrambled up to his feet. Seeing the axe, he pulled it free from the stump and held it out in front of him. "Stay the hell back," Travis demanded. "I swear to God I'll kill you if you don't." Without hesitation, Adam walked towards him. He seemed confused by just how unconcerned his attacker was, and he took a step back. At the last moment, he raised the axe, but Adam simply grabbed the handle and easily pulled the weapon away from him. Travis turned and ran. Adam allowed him to get a short distance away before rearing back and throwing the axe. It spun through the air before the head embedded itself into Travis's upper back. The boy cried out as he fell to the ground. Adam slowly crossed the distance between them. Travis was trying to crawl away, but he could barely move his body. Casually, Adam pulled the axe free from his back and kicked him over so that he was lying face up. Travis opened his mouth to scream. Before any sound could come out, the axe was falling. It sliced into his neck. Blood sprayed out from around the wound. The second cut went through the spinal column, and the third severed the head completely from the body. Adam picked up the head and examined the cut marks on the skin as gore poured from it. They were more confident this time, less ragged and more straight. It wouldn't be long before they were perfect. Going over to the tree stump, he set the head down just long enough to hook the lantern made from his father's skull onto his belt. There would soon be another lantern, and he would have to decide where he wanted to place it. He would not change out his father's with it, however. That was far too important of a trophy to ever be replaced. Carrying Travis's head, Adam went back around the cabin and towards the door. The tools in the workshop were old, and in time they would need to be replaced. For now, though, they would be good enough. The smoke whispers assured him that the lantern didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be able to carry the light. The part of him that had always been a perfectionist demanded that the job be done properly, however. There was a loud noise to his right. He stopped walking and turned towards it. Getting back to her feet near the edge of the trees, a victim of the same slippery slope that he had tumbled down that afternoon, was Jennifer Hines. Sam knew what he was going to find even before he opened the house's front door. When he had arrived at Harry Black's residence, he had immediately seen the skull lantern hanging from the wooden mailbox post. Some of the townsfolk put up decorations shaped like this type of lantern as part of their Sommerstide celebrations, but this was the real thing. He had seen enough of them over the years to know the difference. The door hadn't been closed all the way. Using the tip of his boot, he pushed it open further. Not far enough to expose the entryway to anyone that happened to pass by, but just far enough for him to see inside. It only opened a couple of feet before it struck something on the other side and came to a stop. Sam looked down. The section of flooring that was now visible was covered in blood. The gap wasn't wide enough for him to pass through. Without much of a choice, he pressed his shoulder against the door and pushed as hard as he could. It took quite a bit of force, but he was eventually able to move the obstruction out of the way enough for the door to swing all the way open. The remains of Harry Black's body were splayed across the entryway. His torso was nearly split in half, and his head was missing. It was barely recognizable as human, and Sam wouldn't have been able to identify him if it hadn't been the man's own home. Sam went inside and closed the door behind him. Harry Black had a son named Adam. He quickly searched the small house, but found no sign of the boy. When he went into the garage, though, he discovered a second grisly scene. There was blood all over the floors and walls. Strips of flesh were lying on the concrete. Bits of metal and candle wax covered the workbench in one corner of the room. It wasn't hard to piece together what had happened. This wasn't his first crime scene involving the Carver. Sam sighed and ran a hand over his face. Harry Black had been a shit parent and a shit human being. He had been a drunk, an abusive husband and father, and a criminal. The problem was that he had also been smart enough to hide enough of his failings as a person to keep himself out of jail and away from the most serious charges that every officer in Hollows Grove had been itching to arrest him for. Had he deserved to be murdered and dismembered? That was hard to say. Probably no one deserved that. If anyone did, though, it was that man. With that asshole as his parent, it was no wonder that Adam had cut him to pieces. Each generation's Carver had a different story, but those stories always involve similar elements. Physical or psychological trauma, sometimes both. Feelings of anger towards those they feel deserve that anger. A history of causing or otherwise being around violence. Adam checked all those boxes. It was a damn shame. Adam didn't deserve what was happening to him. He was a good kid. Well, maybe it wasn't too late. Frank Eddington, the sheriff before Sam and the man that had both trained him and smartened him up as to how Hollows Grove really worked, I once told him that a person doesn't just become the Carver. It happened over time, with each kill bringing the person closer and closer until they finally went over the edge. It was a role that someone had to both be chosen for and accept. If he could get to Adam soon enough... His thoughts were cut off by the sound of a man yelling back in the house. Swearing harshly, Sam hurried out of the garage and back to the entryway. Standing in the door was Mayor Hoyt. He was staring at Harry Black's body, the blood drained from his terrified face. A quick glance down at the corpse made it clear that it wasn't Black that he was actually looking at, though. Black's body was now covered in dark shadows. Instead of being still, however, these shadows were writhing and moving about as they tore into the body's exposed organs. Whispers of greed and hunger filled the air. Hoyt opened his mouth to scream again. This time, though, Sam hurried forward and clamped his hand down over the mayor's mouth. Before the man could protest, he half led, half pushed him back outside and shut the door. "Shut up," Sam hissed. "You're lucky that they were too busy feeding to notice your first yell." Hoyt stared wide-eyed at him over his hand. "Listen," Sam snapped. "I said listen. I'm going to let go of you. I can only do that if you calm the fuck down and stay quiet. Can you do that?" After a brief hesitation, Hoyt nodded. Hoping that the mayor would follow their agreement, Sam slowly pulled his fingers away from the man's mouth. His eyes were still wild, but he kept his mouth shut. "Okay, good," Sam said approvingly. "Now, what the hell are you doing here?" Hoyt began unsteadily before swallowing hard. "I saw you leave the station in your patrol car and followed you here. I figured that anything that could pull you away from your daughter had to be serious. Sam, what the hell are those things?" Sam regarded the mayor for a long moment. He had known that he would have to eventually smarten Hoyt up the way that he himself had been, but he had been hoping to put it off a little longer. Maybe this was for the best, though. This kind of experience might make it clear why the man's idea to expand Sommerstide to outsiders was such a bad idea. "Those things are forest spirits," he answered finally. "Don't ask me what kind they are, because that I don't know. What I do know is that they eat the dead, specifically those that are killed for them. Sometimes they like to fuck with people too, tell them things or show them things before they die. I don't know why they do that either." "Forest spirits?" Hoyt repeated slowly. "You have to be fucking kidding me." "You saw them for yourself. Do you have a better explanation?" There was no response to that. "Look, I don't have time for this, Parker. If you want me to explain all this to you, you'll have to come with me." The mayor blinked, clearly trying to keep up with the conversation that was getting away from him. "Come with you where?" Sam hooked his thumb towards the nearby tree line. "Into the forest." For a long moment, Jennifer simply stared at Adam in disbelief, while he looked right back at her with an unreadable expression. Her mind couldn't bring itself to reconcile the person that she had known most of her life with the one she had just watched commit such a horrible act. Part of her told her that she needed to run, but her body remained locked in place. Slowly, Adam opened his fingers and allowed Travis's head to fall to the forest floor. It landed with a dull thud and rolled over so that it was looking away from her. She barely registered what was happening as he moved his now free hand onto the axe handle. He took a step towards her. The spell was broken. Jennifer scrambled backwards before turning and running. She didn't know where she was going. She was completely turned around. All that she knew was that she needed to put as much distance between herself and Adam as possible. Years of high school track had made her fast, faster than Adam certainly, but the thick brush and uneven terrain made traversing the forest difficult. She continued on as quickly as she could. More than once she almost lost her footing because of a hole or gnarled tree root. Each time she was barely able to catch herself and continue on. To make things worse, it was extremely dark and almost impossible to see where she was going. The sky was overcast, and with the overhead canopy being so thick, it blocked out most of the light that there was. When she had come into the woods, she had simply followed the glow from Adam's lantern. Now she didn't have such a guide, and she repeatedly and painfully scraped against trees and other objects as she fled. She could hear Adam chasing her even over the sounds of her own escape. He was crashing through the woods like a demon emerging from hell. It didn't seem like he was nearly as encumbered by the terrain or darkness as she was. The sound of his pursuit echoed off the trees and added to the disorientation. Her legs started to burn from the exertion. She ignored it and continued to move as fast as possible. The forest didn't go on forever. She had to be close to the tree line. She had to be. Jennifer almost laughed out loud when she saw the darkness lifting up ahead of her. She was approaching the edge of the woods. Forcing every ounce of strength from her body, she lunged towards safety. Relief surged through her as she cleared the last of the trees. That relief turned to ash as she realized that she hadn't escaped the forest. Instead, she was in a clearing. The clouds had parted to expose the moon, which had provided the light that she had seen. She forced herself to keep going. If she stopped, she would die. It was that simple. The thought made her afraid, but it also made her determined. She knew what she had to do, and she was going to do it. Reaching the other side of the clearing, she stepped back into the trees. Almost immediately, she was struck by an incredible force. It lifted her off of her feet and threw her back out of the woods and into the center of the clearing. She landed hard on her side. There was an audible crack, and she screamed as her ankle broke. For a moment, the pain filled her and made it impossible to think about anything else. It wasn't until she heard slow footsteps approaching that she remembered what was happening. Sobbing, she rolled over and somehow managed to get back up off the ground. She wasn't able to put much weight on the injured leg, but she hobbled back towards the woods as quickly as she could manage. Escaping was no longer an option. She had to find somewhere to hide. Just before she reached the trees, the clearing erupted in a chorus of the same whispers that had assaulted her back in the restaurant. She still couldn't make out what they were saying. The intent was clear, however. They were both eager and filled with hate. Shadows rose up from behind the trees to block her path. Jennifer was forced to stop moving. A part of her knew that if she continued into those shadows, they would instantly consume her. They stopped at the tree line and didn't come further. Looking around in a panic, she saw that the entire clearing was surrounded by the living shadows. The whispering died down to barely audible. Biting her lower lip, she turned around and faced back the way that she had come. The shadows parted, and Adam stepped into the clearing. If he was winded at all from the chase, he wasn't showing it. He stared at her for what was only seconds, but felt like hours. "Please, Adam," Jennifer pleaded. "Please don't do this." He remained silent and simply watched her. She couldn't tell if her words were reaching him, but she kept trying anyway. "I don't know what's going on or why you've done what you've done. We're friends, Adam. You can't want to do this. I know you." Still nothing. Jennifer couldn't think of anything else to say, but she tried anyway. She rambled on for at least a minute, saying anything that came to mind in an effort to get through to him. It wasn't until she started to repeat herself that she finally stopped talking. Adam started to move. He slowly walked towards her, the axe gripped tightly in one hand. Jennifer backed up, but she could feel the shadows waiting for her and knew that there was nowhere to go. He continued towards her until he was only a few feet away and came to a halt. At some point, he had pulled the hood back up, and his face was hidden in the darkness underneath. Not sure what else to do, Jennifer tried to get around him. His hand lashed out and grabbed her by the back of the neck. His strength was incredible, and he pulled her off the ground before throwing her back down in front of him. Her injured leg flared, and she yelped as she struck the turf. Adam loomed over her, both hands once again on the axe. She looked up at him and knew that it was over. There was nothing else that she could do. If he wanted her dead, she had no way of stopping him. "Please," she begged, You don't have to do this. Adam tilted his head slightly. Moving one hand off the axe, he unhooked the skull lantern from his belt and held it out towards her. He was getting a better look at her. Seeming to come to some conclusion, he attached the lantern to his belt and returned the free hand to the axe. He adjusted his grip on the weapon a few times and started to raise it up. You don't have to do this, she repeated, her voice shaking. He brought the axe up over his head before swinging it downward. All the stories are true, White said slowly as he followed Sam through the dark woods. Sam was careful to keep the beam of his flashlight on the forest floor. It was filled with gnarled roots and heavy debris, and it would be easy to fall if they weren't careful. He chafed at how slow they were moving, but if they went any faster, they were liable to hurt themselves. I can't say that they're all true, he answered, gritting his teeth as a low branch scraped against the side of his face. A lot of them are, though. Let's say for the sake of argument that I believe you, White said. Why in the hell haven't you told everyone about this? And don't give me any crap about trying to avoid a panic. The people need to get the hell out of here. Sam was shaking his head firmly before the mayor had finished speaking. That's the last thing that everyone needs to do, he said bluntly. Do you know why we burn offerings of hazelnuts at Sommerstide? Hoyt blinked. What? Hazelnuts aren't actually ready to be collected at this time of year. The nuts aren't ripe until September, sometimes October. So why hazelnuts? Hoyt stared at him blankly. It's symbolic. It's a life being cut short before its time and offered up to the spirits that have lived here far longer than we have. When we burn the nuts in the fire, we're telling them that we recognize their power and authority over us. They only require it one day out of the year, and in return the other 364 days are ours to do with as we please. That's a balance that we've maintained for going on 2 centuries. What do you think those spirits will do to us if we break that contract? How will they react to seeing a mass exodus of their worshippers from Hollow's Grove? The mayor didn't have an answer for that. I'll tell you what they'd do. They'd kill us all. It's that simple. We'd be the ones burning in that bonfire. Fuck, Hoyt whispered, finally finding his voice. Yeah, exactly. Look, we got screwed the moment that a bunch of people that we've never met made a bargain well before any of us were born, and that fucking sucks. But we have to play the hand that we've been dealt. So the festival only exists to cover up what's really happening in Hollow's Grove, Sam confirmed. That, and to bring as many people together as possible in the safest part of town. There are side benefits, obviously, but those are the 2 big reasons. Hoyt started to say something else, but Sam talked over him. You've got the general idea now, and I promise we'll go over all the details that I know later. He stopped to turn the flashlight towards a noise briefly before moving on. Right now, though, Adam Black is out there somewhere, and he's becoming the new Carver. We might be able to stop it if we can get to him in time. The Carver? White said with a sharp intake of breath. You're telling me that the Carver is real? Sam raised an eyebrow. You were just standing there watching dark forest spirits devour a man's body, and a serial killer is where you're going to draw the line? Who the hell do you think cut up Harry Black? The mayor stared at him for a moment before nodding unsteadily. Yeah, okay, you have a point there. How do we find him? I'm not sure, Sam replied truthfully. I think that I know where we can start looking, though. As if on cue, the trees thinned and they reached a clearing. Nearby was an old cabin, although it was more the size of a large shed. It was in a state of severe disrepair. Sam held up his hand to call for a halt. He then moved his index finger in front of his lips to signal to Hoyt to remain silent. This was the Carver's workshop, and while he didn't believe that Adam Black had fully taken on the killer's mantle yet, it was best not to take any chances. He spotted the body almost immediately. There was a deep wound on its back, and as had been the case at the Black's house, the head was missing. A quick look around the building revealed that unlike the last killing, however, the head hadn't been taken. Feeling a little queasy, Sam turned it over and used the beam of the flashlight to inspect the face. He quickly turned to his left as he heard a scream off in the distance. It was hard to tell with the echo and distortion caused by the trees, but he thought it was a woman's voice. He listened intently, but it didn't come again. You've got your gun, right?" Hoyt whispered to him nervously. "Yeah," Sam answered. "The problem is that it won't do any good against the Carver, or any of the other things we might run into out here." "You have to be fucking kidding me. What are we supposed to do then?" He stood up and cautiously made his way towards the direction the scream had come from. "Well, if you happen to believe in God, this would be a good time to start praying." It took nearly a minute for the body to stop twitching. Adam watched expressionlessly the entire time, the axe clenched in his right hand. Both it and his hand were slick with blood, but he didn't notice. He was oblivious to the world around him with the exception of the dead girl on the forest floor at his feet. A voice in the back of his head, the tiny, almost non-existent part of him that still remained his former self, asked why he wasn't feeling more. His father and Travis Cooper had made his life hell. Jennifer, however, hadn't done anything to him. She had been innocent as someone could be in this town anyway. The voice fell silent. Maybe it realized that there was no point to such thoughts, or maybe the thought itself had been the last gasp of someone that was now as dead as the woman in front of him. He reached down and rolled the body over so that it was lying face up. Moving to its side, he raised the axe before bringing it down with all his strength. His father and Travis had taken multiple swings, and the cuts had been ragged and uneven, but this time, the head was severed with a single clean chop. It separated from the body and turned to one side. The sound of a branch breaking came from behind him. Unhooking the lantern from his belt, he felt the wire dig into his skin as he lifted it up and towards the noise. The axe was still gripped in his other hand, and he unconsciously flexed the fingers holding it. The shadows were gone, and with it their smoke whispers. Even the ones in his head were silent for now. Less than 100 yards away from him, a figure emerged from the trees. In the dark, it was difficult to make out who it was, but as it stepped further into the clearing, he saw that it was Sheriff Miller. A few seconds later, Mayor Hoyt appeared behind the man. Sheriff Miller whispered something to the mayor before raising his hand slightly to show that he was unarmed. In one of his hands was an unlit flashlight. "Hello, Adam," the sheriff said in a nervous but steady voice. "We're not here to hurt you. We're just here to talk." Adam felt a momentary amusement. He was sure that if they'd wanted to hurt him, they wouldn't be able to. The unknown changes he had gone through had seen to that. "Back at the cabin," the sheriff continued slowly. "That's Travis Cooper, right? And she's Jennifer Hines?" "Jesus," the mayor exclaimed. "Shut the fuck up, Parker." "Ignore him, Adam. He's not important. What's important is what's going to happen right here and now." Adam raised the axe slightly and took one step forward. "Wait, hold on," the sheriff said quickly. "That wasn't a threat. What I meant was that we have to focus on what comes next. 3 people are dead, and that's not going to go unnoticed." Adam furrowed his brow. Why would Sheriff Miller want to help him? That didn't make any sense. If anything, it was the man's job to stop him. Here's what will happen, the sheriff continued. We'll tell the families that it was an accident. That Jennifer and Travis came into the woods for, privacy. A lot of young couples do that on Sommerstide. I can't tell you how many teenagers I've had to interrupt on this job. So they came out here and they accidentally fell on some old tree cutting tools in the dark. Adam remained silent. As for your father, well, I don't like to speak ill of the dead, but it's pretty well known just what kind of man he was. Everyone will buy that he finally managed to piss off the wrong people, the wrong out-of-town people. I have to be honest with you, Adam. I think that's the kind of sticky end that he would have met eventually anyway. He still didn't say anything. Go on, then, Sheriff Miller prompted. Take what you need and get to it. It won't be long before Sommerstide is over, and you have to be finished before then. What you're doing is important to everyone, Adam. Sacrifices have to be made to feed those that fill the trees on this particular night every year. Only on this night. And only what it takes to satisfy the spirits. Do you understand what I'm saying to you, son? Adam stared at him for a long moment before nodding once. Good. Our ancestors called it the transfer of fire. The light of a life snuffed out becomes a flame that worships others. That's why what you're doing is necessary. That's why every generation of Hollows Grove needs a Carver. It's why we need you. Adam hooked his lantern back into his belt before reaching down and picking up the severed head. He looked back over at the two men for a pair of heartbeats before turning and heading towards the old cabin. Sheriff Miller was right. There was still much work to be done, and very little time to do it. Being careful not to wake Katie, Sam carefully carried her into the house and used his elbow to close the front door behind him. She had fallen asleep by the time he had gotten back to the sheriff's station, and during both the transfer to his car and the trip back home, she had barely stirred. When she had mumbled something incoherent about a unicorn and a bicycle before passing back out. He took her up to her bed and laid her down on it. It took some effort to remove her shoes. She was in the middle of a growth spurt, and it wouldn't be long until she completely outgrew them and the rest of her clothes. He felt a momentary pang of sadness. His little girl was growing up at a much faster rate than he was really prepared for. He knew that it was a natural part of life, but that didn't change the fact that he wished that this particular part of her life would last just a little longer. After tucking her in, he went back downstairs and set the shoes down next to the closet. It had been a long night, and he was feeling exhausted. He locked the door and slumped down onto the couch with a heavy sigh. He couldn't say that he was thrilled with the way things had turned out. By the time that he had gotten to the boy, Adam Black had already been gone. He'd encountered the Carver before, but never one that had just turned. It had been a chilling experience. The look in Adam's eyes had been horrifying. He wasn't sure how to describe it, even after thinking about it for the past few hours. It was like something completely dead on the inside had been staring at and through him. The thought of that stare made him stand back up and go into the kitchen. He fished a bottle of whiskey out from one of the cabinets. He didn't typically drink, and the only reason he had the whiskey on hand was because it had been given to him as a gift by his staff, and it had felt wrong to get rid of it. Tearing away the seal, he unscrewed the cap and poured a generous amount into a glass before quickly drinking it. When he finished, he repeated the process before returning the bottle to the cabinet and placing the glass in the sink. 3 people were dead. If he was honest with himself, he didn't care about what had happened to Harry Black. The two teenagers were a different story. Travis Cooper and Jennifer Hines had just graduated from high school that spring. They had just taken their first steps into the real world. Their deaths weren't just tragic. They were a waste. Sam glanced out the window above the sink. The moon was completely hidden by the clouds, but he could still just make out the silhouettes of the trees in the distance. He had told Hoyt that the residents of Hollows Grove had been dealt a bad hand by their ancestors. It was more than that. The decision to make a deal with the spirits dwelling in the forest had essentially placed a curse on everyone that was, and would in the future, be living in the small town. In a very real way, every single person was as much a victim as Travis Cooper and Jennifer Hines. He turned away from the window. Even though that was true, he couldn't think like that. He couldn't afford to. He was the town sheriff, and the people looked to him to keep them safe. That was exactly what he did his best to do. Sometimes, that meant making tough decisions, and sometimes, that meant sacrificing the few for the sake of the many. More than anything, he wanted to turn in his badge and just walk away. Doing so would mean that someone else would have to do what he did, however, and he couldn't bring himself to do that to another person. One good thing had come out of that year's Sommerstide. Now that Hoyt understood the truth about Hollows Grove, he had agreed to drop his plans for turning the annual event into a tourist attraction. Bringing in people from the outside world would only increase the risk to everyone, and that was unacceptable. Maybe the events of the night would end up saving more lives than it had cost in the long run. He knew that he was trying to spin things in his own mind, come up with a way to accept and move on from what had happened that night and every Sommerstide before it. He also knew that he wouldn't be successful. Sam sighed again. When the sun came up, Sommerstide would be over, and it would be back to business as usual for another year. He would spend the day with Katie, take her to the park, and maybe over to the next town over to watch that movie she had been begging to see. It would be a good day, and it would make that night feel like a bad dream. That was the hope, anyway. His thoughts turned to when he had taken Katie to the hazelnut grove the previous day. She had been nervous about Sommerstide. He had lied to her and said that there was nothing bad in Hollows Grove. If she asked him the same question now, he would tell the same lie without hesitation. Sometimes that was a father's job, no matter how much it made him hate himself for doing so. Feeling no better than when he had started his internal rationalizations, he went upstairs to watch over his daughter while she slept.